Yes, more years than I care to think about. My love affair with algae started in 1971. So how many years is that? Ooh, 50? Oh, can't do it. A long time. How many of you have thought about algae today before coming here? Shout out, one. It's not enough. How many of you have thought about algae in the last year? Dearie me, one or two. Well, I hope you dream about them tonight. We'll see. To give you some idea of what you're in for, I gave a lecture once when I was being paid for talking about algae. I gave a lecture to one student. And she stayed there the whole time, which was a relief. Okie doke, let's introduce you to them. There are about 10,000 species of algae, and as you're going to hear, they're pretty important. I went to Jelly Park a couple of days ago. Go behind the swimming pool, and there's a lovely spring of fresh water, and it's full of algae. So I'm expecting Jelly Park to be very crowded tomorrow. So in here, give them a good shake. Now, which ones? These are blue-green algae. The classification of these algae is quite simple. So blue-green ones look blue-green, sort of. And there'll be billions of them in there. So many of them are microscopic. These ones cohabiting with the blue-green algae are called green algae because they're green. And again, hundreds of thousands of them in there, individual ones. But of course, many of you might know algae because being Kiwis, you go to the seaside and, I don't know, wander around looking in rock pools and whatever. I went to the Avon Heathcote estuary, and some seaweeds are far bigger than these, but what type's this? Come on. Green. Yeah, well done. You're an expert. These are green algae. And so these are individual ones. This one. This is a red alga because it's brown. But, so there are some complications. Right, let's see if I can work this. Okie doke. This is how you know algae. All these horrible terms and rude words applied to them. The message I want to get across is that these organisms are incredibly important. How many of you think they're important at the moment? Don't be shy. 2 or 3 or 4. We'll see at the end. It'll probably still be 2 or 3 or 4, but let's go. So yeah, blooms, toxins, scum, horrible stuff like that. Now, oh dear, I've got 20 minutes apparently. We're going to cover 3 billion years and lots of different examples, if I make it. But we'll start 3 billion years ago. Breathe in. What are you breathing in? What's important in what you're breathing in? Oxygen, well done. 3 billion years ago, you wouldn't have been around. No oxygen in the atmosphere. The whole globe was pretty well covered by ocean, methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, but there was life. There were tiny little microorganisms in the ocean, forming those sort of bumpy things in the photograph on the right. They photosynthesized, they used sunlight to make sugars, but they didn't form oxygen until 2 billion years ago. And the first type of algae, those blue-green algae, those ones in the bottle are closely related to these ones, which were the first photosynthetic microorganisms to evolve what's called oxygenic photosynthesis. Just like the plants, trees, grass in your back garden, using sunlight for energy, splitting water into hydrogen, oxygen, adding hydrogen to carbon dioxide to make sugar. So they started oxygenating the atmosphere. And that's largely why we're here because of those guys. Today, that's a big number, 120 billion tons of oxygen are produced each year by the algae in the ocean. Some satellite photographs on the left. That light blue colour along the coast is an algal bloom. So all those oceans, 70% of the planet covered by ocean, the top layers are dominated pretty much by photosynthetic algae. Photographed down a microscope top right, those ones are called diatoms. You might have heard of diatoms. And they're all over the ocean. 120 billion tons of oxygen per year. Most of that is used up in the oceans, but some will leak out into the atmosphere. But all those fish, whales, seals, tiny little crustacean, shrimpy-like things swimming around, using the oxygen produced by those algae. Now, here's another link to those ancient algae. The oceans, before we got oxygen in the atmosphere, they had lots of iron dissolved in the water. Oxygen produced by those first algae, the iron precipitated out of the ocean as rust, iron oxide, precipitated down to the sediments. What are the Aussies doing? What have they been doing for the last, 100 years, supporting their economy? Digging that iron ore, digging these big holes and shipping it all off to China or wherever and making lots of money because of those early oxygen-producing algae, which caused the iron to precipitate out. We wouldn't be making that stadium, beautiful object or monstrosity, depending on your opinion. Lots of steel going into it. Steel, probably imported, using ore from Aussie, formed by those algae. So we wouldn't be spending, $683 million if it wasn't for those algae 2 billion years ago that oxygenated the oceans. And then, of course, fossil fuels. Where do fossil fuels come from? Now, we've come forward a few billion years. We're only 100 million years or so ago now. Dinosaurs roamed the earth. Lots of algae in the ocean. So these ones, bottom left, are fossil algae. These are the ones which geologists look for. They get paid by the oil companies looking for signs of which sediments might be bearing oil. So they look for various fossils and microorganisms. And it's those microorganisms, or the feces, the shit of the little crustaceans that ate the algae that then sink down to the sediments. And when those algae die, they sink down to the sediments, get covered by more sediments, get heated up, and become oil and gas. So it's the source of our fossil fuels. So 244 billion tons of oil reserves are known still. Hopefully we won't burn them all. We're using about 4 billion tons of oil per year at the moment. The industry employs about 7.5 million people, and it's fueling about 1.5 billion vehicles worldwide, of which only about 3 or 4% are electric. So we're dashing around in our vehicles largely because of these ancient algae. Now, okay, the algae made the oil. We burn the oil, we release CO2. At the moment, last year, 12 billion tons of carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere due to burning oil. But some of that carbon dioxide is absorbed by the algae in the ocean. So that CO2 going into the atmosphere, as you probably know, CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere. It's about 420 parts per million by volume in the atmosphere in this room is CO2. But, okay, this thing called the biological carbon pump, what's this? Those green circles are living algae in the surface illuminated ocean. They absorb carbon dioxide as they grow and photosynthesize. They die, they sink. So the carbon in their bodies sinks with them down to the bottom of the ocean. And that is like a pump taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere into the ocean, and a certain small amount gets down to the sediments. Now, if we didn't have this biological carbon pump, that's what would happen to the CO2, the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, over decades to centuries. It'd go up much faster than it has done already. We'd be up to 820 parts per million rather than 420 parts per million. And it'd be a lot warmer than in this room at the moment. So algae in the ocean, important in keeping CO2 in the atmosphere lower than it would be otherwise. Something else really, really important, and we're back to these blue-green algae again, these cyanobacteria. You're all familiar with grass and trees and mosses and big seaweeds. All those organisms have structures in their cells, shown by this middle photograph here. These are cells, these are plant cells with these circular structures, circular green structures. So all grass, all tree leaves, shrubs, hebe there, all have these green structures in their cells. Those green structures are called chloroplasts, and they were originally an ancient blue-green alga. So people who study algae have got some reason for claiming all the plants is algae. One reason being they all contain what was originally blue-green algae in their cells. Those are the structures that capture sunlight and do the photosynthesis. Are you convinced yet? I hope you're getting there. The one or two photosynthetic animals. This is a mollusk, a shellless mollusk, and it creeps around on sediments in estuaries. But instead of eating things, it doesn't like killing other animals. What it does, it grazes on this microscopic alga, which forms long hairs, and you can see all the chloroplasts, which were originally blue-green algae, in these hair-like algae. Here they are at higher magnification, and this mollusk absorbs these chloroplasts into its own cells, and it just sits there in the sun to feed. So it's feeding on sunlight and carbon dioxide, an animal, a photosynthetic animal. What might there be out there in space if there's a life in other galaxies? What might happen in the future on Earth if the mad scientists get into genetic engineering modification and tell you that you've got to turn green? Sit there on the shoreline just absorbing sunlight, making your own food. It's possible. And I think these are extraterrestrials from, a few million light years away somewhere. I don't know why they've got a barbecue when they've got green skin and they're photosynthesizing, but there you go. And other animals, this is the three-toed sloth. This one doesn't want to get eaten itself by, a jaguar in the jungle. So it has evolved along with this particular green alga. The green alga camouflages the sloth up there in the tree canopy. And this particular alga has only been found amongst the fur of the three-toed sloth. So it seems to be quite a close relationship. Right, we're still a long time ago, 460 million years ago. Sorry, it's back and forth in time. What now? Yep, we've heard about blue-green algae becoming chloroplasts in plants, but a green alga, something like this one here, is probably the ancestor of all the land plants that we know today. So the very first land plant, they reckon, looked something like this. This is an artist's reconstruction of what the landscape might have been like 460 million years ago. This new evolved land plant along the edge of a freshwater lake, The algae lived in the lake. Somehow it's evolved into this first land plant. And from that first land plant, all these other familiar plants have evolved. The mosses, the ferns, the trees, all our crop plants. So originally, they evolved from a green alga. And then you think of different types of rocks. Now, in fact, I just read this today, sort of swatting up for this. Apparently, about 99% of the carbon on this planet is locked in rocks. Limestone in particular. And this is a type of limestone, chalk. Now, chalk, what's chalk? These are the White Cliffs of Dover. And this is what the White Cliffs of Dover are made of. It's a tiny alga, single cell, that floats in the ocean. They're still in the modern ocean. They evolved over 100 million years ago. 100 million years ago, they died, sank to the sediments, built up in the sediments, formed chalk, and then geology, things lift up like the Southern Alps, and exposed the White Cliffs of Dover. But the White Cliffs of Dover are made of billions and billions and billions of these microscopic algae from the ocean. And of course, we use chalk in all sorts of ways. I've got an artwork. It's not a sticker. Well, so maybe. And I had to swat up on this one as well. I didn't understand all the elements of the artwork, although some are more obvious than others. But they reckon it might have been a sort of cartoon done by the local people in the 18th century as an insult to Oliver Cromwell. That's one hypothesis. Other people think it might have been made in the chalk hills of southern England over 1,000 years ago. So there are all sorts of arguments about it. But okay, chalk for art, chalk for teaching. We'll be going back to this soon. To hell with all these things and this sort of stuff. The kids will learn far more, won't they? If you actually talk to them and write things on the board that they can keep up with. So that's a use of chalk. Liming the fields to increase the pH so the grass grows better so we can export more milk, and actually building things out of chalk blocks. All that due to those ancient algae. But of course, the entrepreneurs, the creative people who want to earn lots of money are onto it. All sorts of schemes using algae in all sorts of different ways, hopefully to human benefit. So the idea here, and this guy here is looking rather pleased with himself, maybe prematurely, I'm not convinced he's going to make billions out of this yet, but the idea is to grow lots of these single-celled algae that made up the White Cliffs of Dover, grow them, and when you grow them, they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. So making your own chalk and using it for building could help absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. In their advertising, they say, we have got to make 40 cities the size of New York every year for the next 50 years to accommodate increasing populations. The population might be 2 billion people more by the end of the century, maybe. Has Donald Trump won the election? I don't know. That might have some influence on this, but yeah, who knows? But there are possibilities for good, perhaps, from some of these applications. Right, something else that's important. How has nature fertilized the ocean? How does it maintain its fertility? Well, again, blue-green algae, which form natural blooms on the surface of the ocean. This is a natural bloom. This is what they look like down the microscope. And this is one of the things they do. They can take nitrogen from the atmosphere, and this is called nitrogen fixation. Think of pea plants, bean plants, legumes, clover in fields. All of those plants are associated with bacteria which fix nitrogen. This blue-green alga can fix nitrogen on its own. And every year in the oceans, it fixes 140 million tons of nitrogen. In New Zealand, we fix something like 250,000 tons each year using a process I'll show you in a second. So, yep, it takes nitrogen from the atmosphere, converts it to protein in cells. When the algae die and decompose, it results in nitrate in the oceans. So this is fertilizer, natural fertilizer in the oceans. Now, this was a discovery this year. Prior to this discovery, the only nitrogen-fixing organisms known were bacteria. And blue-green algae are bacteria, simple cells. This is a more complex cell. This single-celled alga here, we are more related to that than we are to blue-green algae, because blue-green algae are bacteria. So we're quite closely related to this thing. But the big discovery was, not only has it got a chloroplast, that golden brown structure, but it's got another structure in the cell. And it's thought a second blue-green alga became incorporated into the cell. And this one is capable of nitrogen fixation. So this is the first sort of advanced cell which has got structures inside the cell, a chloroplast, a nucleus, a nitroplast. The first advanced cell known to be able to fix nitrogen and use it for its own growth. So that will be helping to fertilize the oceans as well. And it's doing this at about 1 atmosphere pressure, like in this room, and at ambient temperature. Oh, in warm tropical water, it might be 30 degrees centigrade. 1 atmosphere pressure, 30 degrees centigrade, nitrogen fixation. How do we do it? We do it by the Haber-Bosch process, invented early in the 20th century. We use about 200 atmospheres of pressure, temperature up to 1,000 degrees centigrade, fossil fuels, nitrogen, and we fix nitrogen, convert it to ammonia, use the ammonia to make synthetic fertilizer like urea. About 120 million tons per year made by this process. In the oceans, what was it? It was about 120 million tons per year by the algae at 1 atmosphere pressure and 20 to 30 degrees centigrade. Our process results in 450 million tons of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So, yes, ding, 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 ding. People think, oh, maybe we could introduce this other blue-green alga into our crop plants. Genetic modification, whatever, maybe. It's just an idea in some people's brains at the moment. My response is whatever could go wrong. Is it a good way to go to produce more food for more people? Or is it prone to some unfortunate, unforeseen consequences? I don't know. I haven't got the answer. I don't think anyone has. But with regard to this use of algae, blue-green algae as a fertilizer for fixing nitrogen, again, nature has done it first by incorporating blue-green algae into certain of our land plants. So this is a cycad. Some of you will have cycads at home. It's a cycad in the Mariana Islands, and cycads have roots that come up to the surface of the soil. So you find in the roots that blue-green alga in a cross-section of the root. This is what the alga looks like, and it is a nitrogen-fixing blue-green alga associated with the cycad roots. So it takes nitrogen from the atmosphere, converts it to ammonia, and then the cycad uses that ammonia for its own growth. So nature, using blue-green algae as a natural fertilizer. Could we do more of that? But in this case, don't eat fruit bats boiled in coconut milk, which traditionally the people of these islands traditionally did. Now, some of these blue-green algae form nasty toxins, and some of them are neurotoxins, which affect the nerves in the brain. And people who regularly eat fruit bats, or who did, in the Marianas Islands, a proportion of them got a brain disease, which is now thought to derive from toxins formed by the blue-green algae in the roots, and the toxins get throughout the plant. The toxins get into the seeds of the cycad. The fruit bat eats the seeds or the fruits, and then the people used to catch the fruit bats, boil them up in milk and eat them. And the toxin is concentrated from the algae to the cycad to the fruit bat and into the person's brain. So blue-green algae, toxins, keep that in mind. Avoid them if you can. Because we've got them in our own backyard. Waihora, Lake Ellesmere, huge bloom, huge amounts of nutrients draining off the Canterbury Plains, stimulated in recent decades by the increase in the dairy industry. So this stimulates blooms of this blue-green alga. And he can very kindly tell us whether the algae in the lake are toxic or not. So best not to go swimming, probably best not to eat fish caught from the lake if it's during a toxic bloom. And yeah, don't forget about our rivers, especially if you've got pet dogs. Dogs apparently are attracted to the smell of these mats of blue-green algae, especially if they're dried on the riverbeds. Eat the mats of blue-green algae, half an hour later, 4 legs sticking up in the air. It can kill the dogs. So we've got to think about our rivers. You've got a choice of toxins with the algae. You can choose neurotoxic ones that just give you a bad headache, perhaps. Paralytic ones, which are also neurotoxins, but rather worse. They cause paralysis. And there are stories of people eating mussels which have filtered toxic algae like these from the water, eat the mussels, get affected by the toxin, feel tingling around your lips, tingling in the extremities of your fingers, and if you've eaten enough, you stop breathing. So one story, which I believe is true, this happened to someone in Canada. They're out in the Wop-Wops, but their companions hadn't eaten the mussels and they did the old CPR. So the person was still conscious, but they'd stopped breathing. They were paralysed. So they were kept alive with the old pumping of the chest. Yep, so the Marlborough Sounds, blooms of toxic algae in the Marlborough Sounds. And you find a little article in the paper, and the Marlborough Sounds, the mussel beds, shellfish beds have been closed for a week or two because of these toxic algal blooms, possibly stimulated by nutrients running off the land from agricultural activity. But, yeah, there's a good side. Research is going on. These deadly toxins, if they're altered chemically or if they're used in very, very small doses, can be beneficial. So there's all this research going on, all these different afflictions which can attack us. Diabetes, epilepsy, AIDS, cancer, blah, blah, blah. And these algae, these beautiful algae, are producing these complicated toxic chemicals, which in some cases already are being used to treat some of these conditions. In other cases, it's the old statement, more research is needed, which needs more money, of course, and that's getting a bit more difficult. What algae is this? It's green, thank you. Yeah, good one. I've shown you it. Yep. What's the common name? Sea lettuce. That's the name. Oh, yes. And some of these seaweeds can bloom as well. Maybe if you're a sailing fan, you remember the 2008 Olympics. There was a huge bloom of sea lettuce offshore from, is it Guangdong? Where they were doing the yacht racing in the Olympics, and it was stopping the yachts racing. It had become such a thick bloom. They got the army in to dig all the algae out. So the army had a bit of a laugh. And yeah, the races went on. So seaweed blooms can cause a bit of a problem. And we've got our own Avon Heathcote estuary. That's where that specimen came from. I don't think the yachting in the estuary has been sabotaged yet. But this photograph was from about 10 years ago, before they had diverted the outflow from Bromley Ponds down a long pipe into the open coastal waters. The outflow from our wastewater treatment ponds used to go into the estuary. Huge amounts of nutrients, huge growths of algae. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could use those algae for something? But it was just a nuisance. It's still a nuisance, but not as bad as a nuisance as it used to be. So, will we all be eating seaweed soon? About 35 million tonnes of seaweed is produced each year at the moment. And it's fairly edible. I think I've eaten some. Oh, I thought I'd try and get more than a good news by perfectly edible seaweed. Some are not. Don't worry, it was very cheap. I think it was $2.60 for 3 of those little packets. And that was from a supermarket. So they weren't making much money out of it. But, yeah, you can grow this seaweed to eat. Bottom left, I think it's in Tanzania. Bottom right's in Malaysia. It's starting to expand in New Zealand. There are some plans for huge areas of seaweed. Whether that's a good idea or not is another matter, because it will affect coastal ecosystems. But you can grow it, you can eat it, and it's quite tasty, some of it. So will we all be eating seaweed? Wakame. This is one that's eaten a lot in Japan. Nori. You'll all have eaten sushi with the seaweed around it. That's the one that you're eating. That's a red alga, that's a brown alga. And this happy-looking dairy cow, it's had some asparagopsis shoved down its throat. Why? Do you know why? Any guesses? Methane. You know, methane from cattle, from the bugs in their rumen. They belch out methane. It has been discovered that there's a compound in that red seaweed, asparagopsis, which inhibits methane production. So there are startup companies, US, Australia, New Zealand, aiming to grow huge amounts of asparagus and somehow get it out there to the, 18 million cattle or more in the country, which could be difficult. A back-of-the-envelope calculation told me that if you try and grow that seaweed and feed it to all the cattle in New Zealand, you'd need huge areas of seaweed production, unrealistic areas. So it might only be a niche product, but it will be some help, hopefully, in reducing methane emissions, methane being a strong greenhouse gas. And there's another idea. Now this one I put in the pretty daft category. A bit like those phytoplankton sinking down to the bottom of the ocean, taking carbon with them after absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. The idea here is people have suggested mass cultivation of seaweed around the shorelines or from floating platforms, and then sink it into the deep ocean. And the carbon locked up in the seaweeds would sink down to the sediments, and the carbon would stay there, maybe for centuries, maybe for 1,000 years or so, and help remove CO2 from the atmosphere. But it's not a silver bullet solution, because look at the ridiculous areas of seaweed you would need to merely absorb 1 billion tons of CO2. At the moment, annually, we're putting into the atmosphere something like 56 billion tons of CO2, or its equivalent, of other gases. So this, if you wanted to absorb 1 billion tons per year of that 56 or so billion tons we're putting in the atmosphere, you'd need 730,000 square kilometres of seaweed farms. That would be 1 kilometre wide strip around about 60% of the coasts of all the continents. Completely unrealistic. If you were going to use these floating platforms, this one study reckoned you'd need about 16 billion biodegradable rafts with seaweed growing from it, and then you'd sink those once a year, and that would take down the equivalent of 1 billion tons of CO2 down into the deep water. So again, it's not going to happen, but it might happen on a localized, smaller scale. It might be part of the solution, maybe, but certainly not on that huge scale. Now, this is my, well, I could call it my favourite place in Christchurch, because I'm a microbiologist. If you want intense microbiology, go to the wastewater treatment plant. And it has these ponds, you know, Bromley oxidation ponds, they're called. Oxidation. That's important. Microscopic algae, photosynthesis, they produce oxygen. So there's a bloom of algae in the ponds. During the day, they're producing oxygen. So any organic matter left in the wastewater that comes into the ponds, bacteria break that down and they use the oxygen. They need the oxygen produced by the algae. So this is algae with a very positive effect, because without those ponds, all those diseases we've heard about from Nicole, well, not exactly the same ones, but similar ones, would be rife throughout the population. And again, thinking of climate change and alternative fuels, this is a possibility. Again, it's not going to be the solution, but the idea here was, and this was in Christchurch, this was built in Christchurch, it's a big culture of algae next to Bromley oxidation ponds. So using your wastewater, going into the water, stimulating the growth of these algae. See, Donna really loved it, in boots and all. That's a mixing, whatever you call it, mixing wheel that caused the water to go round and round the ponds. And then a guy in Christchurch who had an oil recycling company, he's retired now, Chris, sorry, I forget his family name, Chris, but he converted the algae into biofuel. So the idea here, obviously, grow huge amounts of algae using wastewater and make biofuel. Use that maybe for the few remaining fossil-fueled vehicles or a few aircraft. Unfortunately, there was an earthquake in 2010, 2011, and this essentially disappeared, and it hasn't been rebuilt since. Maybe there are plans to do so. But, okay, maybe we can use them as fuel in the future. We can eat seaweed. Some lucky people have got seaweed to eat tonight. Some animals eat blue-green algae, and you'll know the name of this one. What's this one called? It's spiral-shaped. Spiral-shaped, spiral, health food. Spirulina, you're wrong. It's called Arthrospira. They changed the name. They've got spirulina on the packet, but underneath they say Arthrospira. Oh, these are flamingos in a lake in Kenya. Thank you. Good to have an expert, an African expert. Beautiful flamingos, beautiful plumage. That plumage colour comes from the pigments in the blue-green algae. They've got orange pigments and green pigments in their cells. But there's the flamingo eating the blue-green algae. We can as well. Indigenous people here in Africa, also in Mexico, the Aztecs, used to eat Arthrospira. These are indigenous people on the shoreline of Lake Chad, drying the algae. They add it to bread, I think. It's high in protein and high in minerals. It's a good supplement for other foods. But, of course, you know, the Americans, any Americans here, got to do it bigger and better. And these are ponds in Hawaii. This is what we should have out at Bromley. We had one, and then an earthquake came along. Hawaii grow it in huge quantities. There you go, organic spirulina. You pay through the teeth for it. And it's really Arthrospira platensis. God. But they've persuaded people it's good as a supplement. Maybe it is. I've looked at it down the microscope out of a bottle like that. And not only is there Arthrospira, but there are little animals called rotifers, all dried up, and protozoa, all sorts of things. It's not just the so-called spirulina. And Kiwis are getting into it. Himatangi Beach, the Manawatu. You'll have all heard of Himatangi Beach. It's famous now because it's got New Zealand's first spirulina production. Tahi, artisan spirulina. I don't know why it's artisan. Maybe they're putting stickers all over the place. Spirulina, Himatangi Beach. I hope so. And back to the seaweeds. This is a different theme again. You'll recognise this as wakame, undaria. Japanese, the Japanese love it. They have spread, well, maybe not them, but it has spread all over the show. Mediterranean, Argentina, New Zealand. First found in, I think it was 1995 in Wellington Harbour. Seaweeds grow on the bottom of boats. Boats come from overseas. Seaweeds drop off, reproduce, colonise. That's what happened here in Wellington Harbour. And now it's pretty well around the whole country. They've been trying to keep it out of fjordland, putting a lot of effort into that, a lot of dollars into that. It has occurred in fjordland, but I don't think it's widespread there yet. They're still trying to keep it out. There are other invasive seaweeds as well. So when they were trying to keep it out of places, this is what they were attempting to do. Putting it in bags and bringing them to the shoreline, sending them to the waste dump. But one seaweed will produce millions of spores, which are washed away by the current, settle and grow. So it's very hard to get rid of once we've got it here. Nearly there, if you're getting worried about the time. Oh, I've got the red one, nearly there. This is another example of algae getting around the place. Rock snot, as they called it, because of its appearance on the stones. Didymo, you'll have seen the signs, protect our waters, covering the stones on the bottom of some of the South Island rivers. It's not in the North Island. This is what it looks like. This is what it's like down the microscope. Beautiful. First discovered 2004 in a river in Southland, the Waiau River in Southland. What happens in the Waiau River? Salmon fishing. Where do salmon fishers come from who paid a lot of money? The US. What do they wear on their feet? Boots with felt soles so they don't slip on the rocks. This Algae was possibly brought here from North America to Southland in the wet felt sole of a fisherman's boots, maybe. And now it's the length of the South Island of New Zealand in certain rivers. So, algae, good or bad, ugly or beautiful, some of them beautiful shapes. And I keep thinking of stickers for some reason, but I was thinking, what can I do for stickers? You're going to start seeing stickers with algae on them around the city. So I pose the question, the problem, is it us or them? Are they really, really nasty, or are we changing their living spaces and making them nasty? So putting nutrients into our rivers and lakes. Huge increase in dairy cattle, for instance, the urine going on the pasture, some of that nitrogen getting into Waihora. And of course, boats transporting algae around the world on their hulls. And this is what happens. So the problem, us or them, or is the solution us and them? If we do things right, for instance, growing trees and fencing in streams which run into our lakes, stopping the cattle running around in the streams and defecating and pissing in the water, and then those nutrients going straight into the lake. So doing things like it's shown top left. If we do that, we can keep beautiful clear water like Poo Springs up near Tarkaka. The clearest waters in the world, so I have read. There are several places with the clearest waters in the world, but it is beautiful. Some of you will have been there. Beautiful clear water, full of different types of algae. Look at these ones. These are green algae called desmids. Beautiful shapes. These are the ones that live in pure, low nutrient, clear waters. So, the solution, us or them. Or, I'm suggesting, maybe, do we just need a good hairdo? Maybe. Algae! Yay! Thank you.